Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. My name is Jeremy Champa. Today we're going to be looking at the October 2020 reading section of the SAT, the fourth passage. Let's jump right in. So we'll read the introduction, then we'll do a little skimming. This passage is adapted from Jonah Berger, Contagious, Why Things Catch On by Social Dynamics Group, LLC. Not a lot of information there, but you win some, you lose some with the intros. Okay, so let's read what matters and skip some of the details here. Although geography, I'll go down here so you can definitely see it. My face isn't in the way. Although geography clearly matters in voting, the East Coast leans Democratic while the South skews Republican, few people would think that the exact venue in which they vote matters. But it does. Political scientists usually assume that voting is based on rational and stable preferences. People possess core beliefs and weigh costs and benefits when deciding how to vote. Okay, I would keep going, but I don't see a word but or anything, so I'm going to just jump down to the end of the paragraph. To be clear, if I saw the word but, if it was like people think one thing or political scientists think one thing, but, then I would keep reading. End of the paragraph. In this calculating cognitive model of voting behavior, the particular kind of building people happen to cast their ballot in shouldn't affect behavior. So we're talking about a rational kind of voting. We've already said that this isn't the way when we saw back up on line 5 when it said, but it does. Here's another but. But we weren't so sure. Most people in the United States are assigned to vote at a particular polling location. Polling locations are typically public buildings, all these different places. Different locations contain different triggers. Churches are filled with blah, blah, blah. If we finally get some details, we can skip. I'll jump in with the word and here. Once these thoughts are triggered, they might change behavior. Could voting in a school lead people to support education finding? To test this idea, somebody did something. So we'll skip all of that, and we'll go to the end of the paragraph. 40% of people were assigned to vote in churches, so more methodology about testing this idea. Then we examined whether people voted differently in different types of polling places. We focused on a ballot initiative, so more procedural stuff. I don't care about all those details. Most people support education, but few people enjoy paying more taxes. It was a tough decision. If where people voted didn't matter, then the percent would be the same in both locations. But it wasn't. Okay, I get the idea. It says polling locations had a dramatic impact on voting behavior, and the initiative passed. This difference persisted even after we controlled for things like regional differences in political preferences and demographics. So we're sort of taking care of the counter argument here, right? People are like, yeah, but what about in different areas? It's like, well, we controlled for that. End of the paragraph. The fact that they were in a school when they voted triggered more school-friendly behavior. A 10,000 vote difference might not seem like much, but it was more than enough to shift a close vote. A close election. Okay, cool. And then it says at the end, if 1,000 votes would shift an election, 10,000 certainly could. Triggers matter. Pretty straightforward passage in the sense that we really get a clear idea of what's going on here. The passage is completely certain of which side of the argument they fall on. Triggers matter. Right? Okay, so certainly there was some stuff we didn't read, but we read enough to get started. The main idea of the passage, again, you've heard me talk about this before probably. I wouldn't answer this question first. I will, for the sake of keeping things organized here, for the sake of these videos. On your test, save this till the end of this passage. The outcomes of elections can be attributed to geographic variations. No, we're not talking about geographic variations. We're talking about if you vote in a church or in a school, that will change it. Politicians exploit triggering? No, they could. That's not the main point. Voters' attitudes towards education funding, that's too specific. Voting decisions can be influenced by the surroundings. Yeah. Notice that very specific answer choice was going to be out. Answer choice C, even though they are talking about education funding, that's not the main idea. That was an example of the sort of phenomenon they were talking about, this sort of thing we can observe in the world. Triggers matter. What does the word exact mean on line 3? I'm not sure. With these vocabulary, words, and context questions, remember you always don't rely on a pre-existing idea of what the word means. The the exact venue here, what would the word exact mean? Something like the precise or the specific venue, the difference between a school and a church or something like that. So let's see. The particular would make sense here, right? And whenever you find the right answer, it will fit perfectly into the answer choice. It's not, none of these other words would fit directly into the place of the word exact here. So don't rely on a pre-existing knowledge of what the word exact means. Use context. Pick your own words. In my case, it was like sort of precise, I think I said, or sort of the specific spot. And in this case, particular worked. I always think that last move is the most important. Literally, so I'll just do it so that you can just see me do it. Take the word particular and make sure it reads perfectly. It's not awkward at all. So few people would think that the particular venue in which they vote matters. That's exactly what we're talking about. So, okay, I like that answer. Moving on to number 33, the passage suggests that most experts who hold the traditional view of voting behavior would say that the school funding initiative in the 2000 Arizona general election passed because the majority of voters, the traditional view. Okay, so that's different than the new view. And this is this is an evidence set. It's kind of phrased a little bit funny. It says, which choice best illustrates the view referred to in the answer to the previous question? That's an evidence set. Look, it should be chronological, so it should be kind of early, but, we don't know that for sure. But the traditional view, I'll look at the early lines. I'm expecting also, I'm seeing if there's any other lines below to help us. Not really, but it's probably one of the first three. I'm looking for something about the traditional view. Look, I know from my skim that this paragraph is the traditional view. Right? This was the one where they said, this is what people usually think. So let's find evidence that goes with those lines. Maybe 11 to 13. Let me go back up. 11 to 13 says, if we're concerned about healthcare, we support initiatives that make it more affordable and available to the greater numbers of people. That's pretty specific. I'm going to go back and see if there's any other evidence that's a little bit more broad. 1 to 4. 1 to 4. Although few people would think that the exact venue in which they vote matters. Yeah, but that's not necessarily explaining as this question asks, the logical view. Most directly. Let's look at 25 to 30 just to be sure. It's a little bit later than I would expect it to be in this case, but no, this is about the new view, not the traditional view. So I guess I'll go back up to those lines 11 through 13, if we through people. So that's, if we're concerned about healthcare, we support, look, the lines above that really speak to what we're looking for. I think that's going to be the right answer, though. I'll check just to be absolutely certain. I'll check the evidence. Where is it here? Sorry, I'm getting lost in my scroll. 46 to 47. I'll check it. It's dramatically out of order. No, those lines don't talk about the traditional view. They just talk about the fact that it's hard to make a decision to support education if you don't like paying more taxes, but of course you want to support education. So a classic sort of struggle. That's not the traditional view of voting, though, which is that people make rational decisions. So I'm going to go with 11 to 13 because it at least talks about, it's a little specific. If we care about healthcare, then we're going to, but that's at least talking about, that's the right part of the passage. Believe that the initiative, so let's see, we say that the school funding initiative in the 2000 Arizona general election passed because, for rational reasons, people liked the initiative. So that's probably A. It's not, the triggers is not the traditional view, so B's out. And C would suggest that they were swayed by, sort of messaging. That's the traditional view. Again, go back up. What does it say? Political scientists usually assume that's the traditional view, that voting is based on rational and stable preferences. People possess core beliefs and weigh costs and benefits when they're deciding how to vote. And then these lines 11 to 14 are one example of that idea. Just that people believe in this, accord with their reasoned views, rational. That's the right answer. Now, this answer is relevant, this geographic factors piece, but that's not the traditional view of voting behaviors. The traditional view of voting behaviors is that people make rational choices. And again, the evidence to that is right here. The traditional view, what people usually assume. So mapping with evidence sets, I can map on traditionally to usually assume here. Rational beliefs, I can map on to, scrolling out of control. Rational beliefs, I can map onto reasoned views. Right? That's the way you do evidence sets. And it's not out of chronological order, so it makes a lot of sense. For 34, it was B. Okay, question 35. In the passage, the author most directly characterizes himself and his research team as. So remember, we're going to use chronology here. We know that the last question was dealing with lines 11 to 13, so we know we should be after that and probably before the 40s. And he characterizes himself and his team. I do remember this word. Let's find it here. The word we on line 17. We weren't so sure. What weren't they so sure about? They weren't so sure that people behave rationally when they're voting, and that the environment in which they're voting has no effect. They're not sure of that. So, unconvinced by certain assumptions sounds great here. Displeased with certain political efforts to manipulate how voters behave. Now, that's logically be like, hey, why are we manipulating people? That's bad. That's not what the passage is about, though. The passage is people are affected, not that there's certain efforts to manipulate or affect people. And then answer choice B is really close. It's great other than this phrase, the lack. They are dissatisfied on the general agreement, with the general agreement on how voters think and act. They think, the rational view, which is the general agreement, that people behave rationally when they vote, is incorrect. The word lack makes this answer choice wrong because it means then the opposite. And alarmed by the strength of their findings regarding how easily voters can be influenced. We haven't talked about the findings yet, and it didn't say we were shocked by it. So you might see at the end of the passage that triggers really matter, and that means that they're, convinced of the strength, but alarmed isn't quite correct here, and it's out of chronological order. So the chronology really helps you get rid of that answer. Okay. 36, which choice best supports the idea that many voters felt deeply invested in the outcome of the vote of the school funding initiative? Deeply invested. And it should be hopefully before line 54. You can't always use the vocabulary questions like number 37, the word in context questions, as boundaries, but it's at least a good start. I would say probably one of those answers in the 40s. Deeply invested is what I'm going to pay attention to. I got kind of lucky. The initiative had been hotly debated with both good arguments on both sides. I'll go a little bit above. When we examined, so none of the stuff in the 40s talks about strong feelings except that deeply invested part. Hotly debated is the deeply invested part. It's got to be line 45. Let's just make sure. Do the mapping game. So deeply invested, yes, that's like we said, hotly debated. Many voters, outcome of the vote. I don't know though. The outcome. We haven't talked about the outcome yet. So I'm doing this mapping game. I may have just saved myself from getting that answer wrong. Let's see. Well, it does say that the initiative passed. More than 10,000 more people voted in favor of the school funding initiative when the polling place was at a school. Okay, so now that talks about deeply invested. The stuff below, do we see that somebody was like really excited about, look, it has to be that answer choice. Good arguments on both sides. Now, I was interpreting outcome to mean after the fact, but if they're deeply invested in the outcome, it's been hotly debated. That means people really care. So my mapping game was important there, but ultimately I was misinterpreting outcome. Deeply invested in the outcome, not like after the fact, but the outcome meaning even at the beginning, before the votes have been counted, before people have voted, you could still be deeply invested in the outcome. And I'll just check 63 to 65 to just see, because sometimes the vocabulary is a bad lower boundary. A significantly higher percentage of people who voted in the schools. Now that kind of says that like the triggers matter, not that people were like deeply invested, but that just people, made that vote because they were in a school perhaps. Okay, dramatic. Now I'm guessing theatrical is probably wrong. It's probably striking, but let's just see. Remember, primary definitions are usually wrong. On line 54, polling locations had a striking impact on the voting behavior. Yes. They didn't have a abrupt impact or a sensational impact, a striking impact, a big impact, a shocking impact would be a word I might put in the place there. Abrupt would mean short or sort of out of nowhere, like sort of quick. That's not what we really mean. Sensational is kind of meaning sort of to make it more emotional than it would otherwise be. To sensationalize something is to make it seem more extreme. That's not what we're talking about. Okay, so 38. Which statement best describes the function of the last paragraph in the context of the passage as a whole? Okay, well, what does the last paragraph do? It sort of says, look, this 10,000 vote difference might not seem like much, but it is. It's enough to shift an election. Then they show us that a presidential election came down to 1,000 votes. So 10,000 certainly is a big deal. Triggers matter. So what does this do? It shows us that if you think that this isn't a big deal, they're showing you that it actually is a big deal. Let's see what the answers say. Now, I don't know about D. It summarizes the argument the author sought to overturn with his research. That one's kind of complicated for why I think that's wrong. Let me move. That one sort of just stuck out to my eye. I'm not totally sure it's wrong. I'll start back up at the top. It addresses a potential criticism. And get this out of the way so you can make sure you see it. Of the author's argument. Yeah, well, that criticism would have been, if you think this is not a big deal, it is, by providing context in which the criticism should be understood. If you think 10,000 isn't a big deal, it is, because 1,000 is the 1,000 shifting in a presidential election is the context. So maybe A. It suggests that the author's findings may shed light on a phenomenon in fields other than political science. No, we're still talking about politics. It concedes the existence of a significant exception to the rule. No, it's actually proving that 10,000 votes is a big deal, not that there's some exceptions. Because the 1,000 votes wouldn't be an exception. It would be like, oh no, this is 10,000 is a big deal. So C is out. It's definitely down to A and D. It summarizes the argument that the author sought to overturn. No, that would be summarizing the argument you seek to overturn. Like, this might, in a way, sort of solidify the argument. And, but the argument that the author sought to overturn is different. The argument the author sought to overturn is, it doesn't matter where you vote. Triggers don't matter. So it doesn't summarize that argument. It summarizes his argument that he seeks to overturn, sort of the traditional view, right? So D is so close. Notice this is important. When I got it down to 2 answers, it was a lot easier for me to see why D was wrong. At first I was like, oh, maybe that's right. I don't know. Maybe it's wrong. Once I got it down to 2 answer choices, it's a lot easier to focus on those little details because it's one of these two. You're sort of, that you're homing in on the answer. So once you're into that situation where there's 2 answer choices, it's a little bit easier in my experience and in the experience of, many of my students to make a decision between those 2 answer choices. So it's a strange phenomenon that's the case, but I found that to be true. So I got rid of a couple bad ones. Then it was a lot easier to see why A was right. And again, the mapping game, it was like, what is the potential criticism? This isn't a big deal. What is the context? Well, a much smaller number of votes made a big difference. And that is context for seeing why this criticism that it's not a big deal is wrong, right? Or should be understood. Okay, so number 39. Which statement best identifies a weakness in the author's claim in the last sentence? He says triggers matter. Restates the claim that triggers matter, but does so without having offered examples of triggers in the passage. Oh, they certainly have. The triggers were like at a school and stuff like that. lockers. I mean, I'll show you exactly where. Um, it was this paragraph that we kind of skipped over the details. Churches, here's some triggers. Religious imagery. Schools are what might remind people of early educational experiences or children. Those are triggers. So there is examples of of triggers there. The author characterizes his claim about triggers as innovative, whereas the passage as a whole suggests that many scholars offer similar explanations for voter decisions. I would have to find many scholars in the passage. I don't think that's the case, but I'll hold on to that. The author states that a trigger influenced a particular election, but fails to provide evidence for this claim elsewhere in the passage. No. The author does not say that a trigger influenced the presidential election. Gore, Bush. The author states that election was decided by a small margin, and therefore, if a trigger can cause a 10,000 vote swing, that's enough to change the election. So that answer is close because there is no trigger mentioned for the presidential election that they mention, but that's not the argument they're making. The author makes a general claim about the significance of triggers, but the passage provides evidence of only one instance of a trigger affecting voting actions. That's absolutely true. One instance we see that it happened was this one, the only study that they did. Triggers matter. So D seems like the best answer here. I didn't get rid of B yet, but I don't think there was other scholars. Suggest that many scholars offer similar explanations for voter decisions. No, the passage suggested that the general view is that people make rational decisions. Political scientists usually assume that it's rational and stable. That's line, if you can't see that because my face is in the way, there it is, line 6 and 7. So that was really tricky, especially answer choice C, but I hope you can see why that's wrong now. Maybe if you got it down to those two answers, if you had an easier time of getting rid of the scholars thing in B, then maybe you would have been down to C and D, and that may have helped you there. Yeah, so that was subtle. But to be clear, one more time with C, the reason that C is incorrect is that we don't need evidence that a trigger affected the presidential election. That is not what that example of the presidential election of Bush-Gore is about. It's about showing us a small margin, and therefore our evidence that a 10,000 vote swing happens due to a trigger proves that triggers matter because it's bigger than the margin of a presidential election. So that's why C is wrong. Couple more here. Number 40. The table most clearly indicates that which statement is true of voters who live within 0.2 miles of a school and voted in a school. Okay, well, let's see if we can find those people. Voters who lived 0.2 miles of a school and voted in a school. Where is the chart? Voting in a school is everyone. That's increased percentage of the likelihood of supporting school funding initiative when voting in a school. All voters, here's the ones that live within 0.2 miles of school. Increased percentage of likelihood for voters living 0.2 miles within a school. Initial results after controlling for demographics. Increased percentage likelihood. 0.5% more likely to vote in favor of supporting school funding. It says increased percentage, 0.5 roughly, 0.58, 0.56. They supported school funding at a higher rate than voters who lived within 0.2 miles of school and did not vote in a school. I think that's what we're saying. Let's be careful. Let's get rid of some other answers. They demonstrated no change in the likelihood to support. No, that's true. That's not true. There is a change. It was 0.5%. So B is out. They were more likely to support school funding initiatives than to support other initiatives in the election. We don't know what the other initiatives were, I think. So I think C's wrong. I'll double check that. They accounted for a larger percentage of voters in the election than did any other group. We actually don't know how many of these people we're talking about here. It doesn't tell. It just tells us a percentage. So D is out. And we don't know anything about other initiatives. So even though I wasn't absolutely certain of A, A. They supported the school finding initiative. I think it should be funding. That's a typo because this was somebody typed this up not the official College Board. This was a real test, but it was given in a funky format when it was given back to students, so they reformatted it. That's why that typo is there. It won't happen on the real test. They supported the school funding initiative at a higher rate than voters who lived within 0.2 miles and did not vote in a school. I think what we're saying is, and we'll double check this, likelihood when voting in a school, increased percentage, likelihood when voting in a school. So that 0.5% means they're more likely to vote that way when they're in a school, this group of people, the ones that live within 0.2 miles, than if they were in a different location. So that is exactly right. That's why it's got to be A. Okay, and the more important thing was that I was able to figure out what was wrong with these other answer choices. B was wrong because the second column, the control for demographics, was still 0.56% or something. That was maybe the closest one. We didn't know how many larger percentage of voters in the election than any other group. We don't know what percent of the voting population. We just know what percent more likely they were to vote a certain way. Not like anything about the size of the group. And we don't know about other initiatives. That's why C was wrong once again. 41. Based on the passage, the data in the last row of columns B and C of the table help the author and his team to B and C last row. Let's see. B and C last row. Okay, so that must mean, results after controlling for demographics. This means that, like, they're saying, look, it doesn't, like, maybe certain people of certain demographics have a certain way of voting, right? They said at the beginning, people in the East Coast vote a certain way, people in the South vote a certain way. You could also say that, like, people who live in cities vote a certain way, and people who live in suburbs vote a certain way, or how much money people make. So, like, all those things are part of demographics, sort of ways of categorizing people. So this is helping us control for demographics, because, like, you might be like, well, people who live within 0.2 miles of a school are a certain way, right? They look a certain way or they behave a certain way. Controlling for demographics means that, maybe if you live close to a school, you're more likely anyways, or, maybe a certain kind of people lives within 0.2 miles of a school and they're more likely to vote one way or another. Controlling for demographics gets rid of that bias. So let's see. Identify additional examples of the rule of triggers. No. Rule all alternatives to the explanation. Yes. Show that outcomes of multiple elections. We don't have multiple elections. C's out. Explain why proximity to a school affected the decisions of people who did not vote in schools. We have no idea about the people who didn't vote in schools. It's just the ones who voted in schools. So it's got to be B. It rules out alternatives for the explanation. You can't be like, yeah, but those are a certain kind of people. That's why we controlled for demographics. That's why it's B. Notice that a lot of these graph questions, it's about getting rid of answer choices. That's the best advice I can give you. Get rid of answer choices. Also, really important, and I know it sounds like you've probably heard this before and people say this all the time, but, like, the problem for a lot of people with graphs is that they jump right to the data and they don't read the titles and the columns and stuff. Like, I've learned from the experience of making mistakes a bunch of times, right? So if you've made mistakes like that, commit to reading the titles and reading the heads of the columns and really thinking about what this graph is generally saying, the chart is generally saying, before you start trying to analyze it, right? Sometimes you might even have to read this little part at the bottom about, adapted from contextual priming, where people vote affects how they vote. Sometimes that information matters. Usually it's just the title and the titles of the columns and rows that matter the most, though. Take the time to really process that information. Sometimes what you can do is put stuff in your own words that can really help for you to feel like you really actually understand what's being said. That is, get active with your comprehension. Don't just say, I think I get that. Put it in your own words, then you'll see if you really can put it to the test. You look at these words. Okay, the increased percentage likelihood. So how much more likely as a percentage voters who live really close to the school? That kind of thing, right? We could further interpret this because, look, it's actually the people who aren't living close to the school, it has a bigger effect, right? You figure people who live close to the school are more likely to support the school. People who don't live close to a school but then have to go to the school and vote, all of a sudden they're like, oh gosh, I'm going to have to, I feel bad. I want to help these kids. That's what we're talking about. Okay, hopefully that was helpful. Feel free to send me any messages you want. criticisms, whatever, get in touch. I'll say it again. I always say it. Work with a friend. Get someone who is motivated to do well on this test. If you need help finding somebody, maybe I can help match you with somebody. But the internet's full of people trying to get better at this test. Meet with friends, peers, other motivated students, and run through these methods. You need to talk this stuff out and try this stuff out. And then when things go wrong, sort of bounce ideas off of students. Why were you thinking this one's right? What did Jeremy say about this strategy or that strategy? And I know, look, I don't have all the answers, but I have been doing this work for a long time. And the most important thing you can do is get good at thinking in the specific way. You're not just saying what's true and what's false and playing a general rhetorical game with language. You're saying, what is the case on SAT questions? What is the case? What can we use from answers to previous questions that we can use to sort of help us make a decision between answer choices on other questions? So hopefully that's helpful. I'll see you next time. Take care. Happy studying.